I'm competing in Memphis in May this year, so I wanted to know the best competition brisket method to get me called for an award. Competition brisket methods usually fall into one of two categories. Either they're cooked whole, like this Packer brisket, or the point is sliced from the flat and they're cooked separately. Myron Mixon cooks his briskets whole because he says it exposes less surface area to drying and produces juicier results. But most competition cooks I talk to these days actually separate the point and the flat because they say that it creates more uniform slices, it creates better bark, and it just simply cooks faster. So to find out who's right, I'm smoking 2 choice grade briskets and I'm putting them head to head in a taste test. For the whole brisket, I'm slicing off just a little of the hard side fat so it lays a bit flatter. Myron actually recommends not touching this at all because it just exposes more surface area to drying, so I'm kind of meeting him halfway and just taking off a little bit. Then all the silver skin gets removed according to Myron's method. He does this so the rub will penetrate the meat better. Personally, on my backyard briskets, I don't remove the silver skin, but on my competition briskets, I actually do because I do agree that it helps with salt penetration, and it also creates a more uniform and better looking bark on the bottom of the flat, which using Myron Mixon's method turns out to be the top of the brisket slices, which the judges will be directly looking at, so it's really important to get those looking really nice. The fat cap stays on the flat to protect it and keep it juicy, but we'll slice it off as a final step before we turn it into the judges, which in this case will be me. And I'm removing all the fat on top of the point. In Myron's videos, he does this so the point forms a nice bark, and he feels that the point already has enough intramuscular fat, so he just lops it right off. Also, competition teams just don't often turn in brisket slices with the fat cap on. They remove it either at the start before they even cook it or right before turn-in because most competition teams feel that the judges don't like fat at all. And I agree with this to some extent. I think that the reason that a lot of competition teams are afraid to turn in brisket slices with a fat cap is because a lot of them have turned in slices with an unrendered kind of white opaque fat cap where the judges almost have to peel it off and it's not squishy, it's not rendered, it's not caramelized. So I think that if you turned in a slice that was rendered all the way down to the meat and it was ooey and gooey and it was caramelized and it was just fully rendered down and integrated with the bark, then I think a judge would actually really like that, but that's a little harder to get right without overcooking the meat. So in general, competition teams will recommend just removing all of the fat before turning it into the judge. Now, for the second brisket, I'm also removing the silver skin and then I'm finding the fat seam on the bottom of the point and separating it all the way down until the point gets super thin, and then I slice it from the flat. Now I'm taking the flat and cutting it into a size so that the slices will fit into a turn-in box, and then I'm flipping it over and removing all the fat from the flat because again, judges don't like fat. Maybe. But I should note that some teams actually leave the fat cap on the flat to protect it. Let's say they're cooking in a drum smoker where all the heat's coming from below. They'll leave that fat cap on the bottom of the flat, and then as a final step, they'll slice it off before they turn it into the judges. So there's a couple different ways of doing it. So we'll be getting all of our slices from this chunk of the flat. Now I'm removing all the fat from the point and I'm cutting it into a rounded square. We'll be cubing this up later and getting our burnt ends from this cut. Back to the whole brisket, it's been injected with Cosmos Q Smokehouse Reserve, and I'm rubbing it with Smoke Trails Barbecue Brisket Rub. Then I'm doing a final finishing layer of Lowry's Seasoned Salt. Same thing with the separated point and flat chunks, a layer of Smoke Trails Barbecue Brisket Rub, which you can buy on Amazon. I'll link it in the description section below, by the way. And a layer of Lowry's for some extra salt and savory notes. I'm lighting up my offset now, just getting some splits on the fire and letting them burn down to coals before I start adding smaller splits and maintaining temps at around 275 to 300 degrees. Now I'm adding a steel water pan to the firebox to add humidity and help control temps. Now the briskets are going on the offset. Myron places his brisket in an aluminum pan over a raised rack to keep it out of the drippings, so keep that in mind. This method deviates from his method a little bit because I'm just putting it in naked. I think that putting it in a pan would actually help protect it quite a bit and maybe prevent it from drying out a little bit, especially on Myron's smokers, which tend to have bottom-up heat, so that pan is really protecting that brisket from the heat coming from below. But I'm using an offset smoker where all the heat is coming from above, so I think it'll be just fine naked for now. An hour or so later, the briskets look like this. The bark is starting to set, but isn't quite there, so I need to keep going unwrapped. I didn't like how the edges of my flat and point chunks are getting a little bit dry, as you can see here, so I'm going to foil both them to protect the edges, and I'm putting some foil on the whole brisket point because it's drying up a little bit too fast for my liking. Another few hours later, maybe 3 total, the briskets look like this. The bark isn't perfect, but it's good enough, and these briskets are thin and lean, so I wanted to preserve the moisture over the bark. So I'm now wrapping the whole brisket in foil and adding clarified butter to the wrap so it's about halfway full. Keep in mind, Myron Mixon uses a beef consommé mixture and not liquid fat like you see me using in this video. Now the point and flat chunks are also getting wrapped the same way with clarified butter, and they'll all go back on the smoker. 5 hours later, I'm checking for doneness. Starting with the separated flat, I'm just probing for tenderness, and then most importantly, I'm picking it up, and I should be able to easily push through the fibers, which I can, so I know it's done. The temperature when this happens is lower the longer the cook is, so around 195 after a 12 to 14 hour cook, but in this shorter 8-hour cook, I had to go all the way up to 205 to get it this tender this fast. And the point is also tender. You can see how I can easily poke my fingers through it. So both the point and the flat chunks are going into my holding oven at 150 degrees overnight. In a competition, I would use a pellet smoker to do this because you have to use charcoal or wood-fired smokers. You can't use electric heating sources in most competitions. Another hour later, the whole brisket is finally tender enough so that I can poke my fingers through the fibers, and it's also probing tender, so it's going in the holding oven as well. Myron Mixon doesn't hold his briskets overnight, he just rests them for a few hours. I'm using a little bit of a different method because it's just more convenient for me to put a brisket in the holding oven overnight. It breaks up the cook, it lets me go and do all the stuff I need to do with 2 small children in the house. It also makes competitions easier for me so I can get some sleep, and I feel like it allows me to pull the brisket at a little bit lower of a finishing temperature or finishing tenderness and still get the same results because it still has that long hold period to get really nice and tender over a long period of time. All right guys, it's the next day and I have all of these briskets and parts of briskets out of the holding oven. I've got the whole brisket here. It looks like it didn't get as dark as I wanted on the very tip here, but our primo slices that I would be turning in are right about here, and they've got plenty of bark on them, so I'm okay with that. The separated brisket is looking very dark, very nice. Look at the flat there. It's looking beautiful. And then we have the point right there. Now at this stage, if I was at a competition and I separated the point from the flat, what I would do is I would start cubing up my burnt ends. I would sauce them a little bit with some au jus and some sauce. What I use is the au jus that comes out of the wrap. I put it in a grease separator. I separate the fat from the jus, and I take the jus and I mix it with some sauce. And I'll show you that later, but I have to put these pieces of brisket back in the holding oven because we still have a little bit of time because I need to separate the point and the flat and put the point back on the smoker for about an hour and a half. Okay, back to the whole brisket. Now in Myron Mixon's videos, what he does is he flips it over to the fat side. And then you guys will recall that we left the fat on one side and we left the point side bare. And what he does is he just starts the slice right here and he carefully cuts through the seam. And I'm being way more careful than he is. He's way more pro at doing this. So I'm kind of carefully cutting it away, being careful not to cut into the flat too much. And now he takes the flat and he covers it up in a blanket to allow it to rest for another hour. So I'm just gonna put it back in the holding oven. And then you can see on the point, we have a huge bare side that's just bare meat that hasn't seen any smoke. So what Myron does in his videos is he cuts off the excess fat here and he kind of levels it off. I'm gonna sacrifice a little bit of the meat here just to make the brisket a little bit more level. And now I'm coming back in and I'm applying a little bit of rub on the bare side of the meat that didn't see any spice rub or any smoke throughout the entire cooking process. And a little bit of Lowry's. Again, I'd probably use a different mixture of rubs if I actually did this for competition, but this is what I'm using today. And now it's going exposed meat side up on my offset smoker because that's where all the heat and the smoke is coming from. And I want to form some bark here, and that is going to go on the smoker for about an hour and a half. Now, while we're waiting for the bark to set up on that point, I'm just going to go ahead and slice up this point and flat, the separated ones, and I'm going to show you how I would present them in a turn-in box. So first of all, what I do is I take some of the jus that came out of the briskets and I mix it with a little bit of sauce, a pretty sweet sauce, and I just keep adding more au jus until I can just get a hint of sweetness, but it's mainly savory. And then I also used a grease separator to separate a lot of that clarified butter off of the au jus, and I'm gonna use that to coat the front of the slices because this is a big problem in barbecue competitions relating to beef brisket. And it really hit home for me when I started to judge KCBS competitions. A lot of the times when I was sitting at the judging table, the table captain would come around and show us the brisket slices, and they'd be really oxidized and dry looking. I knew they weren't necessarily dry, but they just looked dry because what happens is when you slice brisket, the exposed meat starts oxidizing. It reacts with the air and it starts oxidizing and it looks dry. So what we need to do to stop that is as soon as we slice a brisket, we take a dip of our fat, doesn't matter what it is, could be tallow, could be clarified butter, and then slice that exposed meat. That's gonna stop the oxidization and keep the meat looking nice and juicy. So let's give this guy a slice. We're gonna start right here because these are gonna be our slices. We want them nice and uniform. Like I said, immediately it gets a slathering of some fat so it doesn't oxidize. And then I start making my slices. It kind of depends on how tender the actual slices come out. In this case, this is a pretty lean brisket. I would never use this in a competition because it's super lean. I would use like a Wagyu or prime grade. Let's give it a pull. Pulls apart nicely. It's perfectly cooked, so what I'm gonna do is just make regular size slices, about a 1/4 inch. And I'm just gonna go like this because I'm so used to it. Sorry guys, I can't show you. Coat these slices. Slice, coat, slice, and coat. Okay, now that's 7 slices right there. And the reason that I do 7 slices, you only need 6 slices, 6 serving portions in a KCBS competition, but I add an extra slice for the table captain just so they get a nice little treat. It's just kind of brisket etiquette in a competition. So you guys can see that I got a little bit of shredding on the edges here so the edges don't look uniform. So at this point, I kind of make a judgment call and see if I want to either keep that. Maybe I might just, you know, try to piece that back together and it could just stick there. Because what happens in a KCBS competition is the table captain comes around and shows you the box, and then you give your appearance score, and you can't change that score afterwards. So after it goes around the table and everyone marks down their appearance score, and you lift your brisket out with a fork and it crumbles in half and the edges fall off, then you can't change your appearance score and say, ah, this is actually a 7 instead of a 9. So you can do something like that, where if it looks good, you can kind of piece it together like that. But most of the time, I might just decide to make a judgment call and kind of square up the edges and go like this and just make completely square cuts. Because it ends up just looking a little bit more pretty. Okay, now I'm gonna come in with my sauce and I'm just gonna give it a nice coating, just adding some color. I might get the exposed sides here. And then we'll go down like this. A little bit more sauce on the back. Just adds a little bit more salt and sweetness. And I'm also coming in with a little bit of powdered salt mixed with some of my Smoke Trails barbecue brisket rub ground up into a super fine powder. And I'll just give it a light little dusting, very light, just to add a little bit of salt to the back of the tongue. Now the second slice gets sauced, a little bit of dusting. And you guys can see already, this takes a long time. So unfortunately, when the brisket actually makes it to the judges, it could be a good 15, 20 minutes since you actually removed it from the heat source, and it could be quite cold. So that's one of the catch-22s of using some sort of fat to prevent the oxidization on the brisket. Sometimes, and I've seen this in turn-in boxes, it can kind of start to solidify and look kind of waxy on the surface, and that might detract from both your appearance and your taste score if you're not careful. So try to have that fat super hot when you put it on the brisket to prevent the oxidization, and try to have your brisket as hot as possible within reason before you start this whole process. Okay, now I'm gonna give it a nice little coat of the au jus over top, and we'll set that to the side. Now I'm gonna deal with my burnt ends, and what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna look for a relatively square edge here, and I'm going to make a slice of roughly 1-inch cubes. I might go like this because it tends to get more juicy the further you go into the interior. So you might not want to use the very edge parts because they're a bit too crispy. They might be a bit too dry, but they might be good. So you can test one. I usually take the thinner edge here. That's pretty good, but I'm not liking the way those are shaped. So I'm probably going to use this one here. And again, I want to make 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Just little bites. I kind of go like that. So they're all kind of uniform in size. Just keep on putting the larger chunk here, using it as a guide for my knife. Now I'm going to coat everything in the fat, and I'll sauce it up. And then I might come back in here and do a little surgery to this because some of them are taller than others. And I took out the 7th burnt end that was supposed to be for the table captain because it didn't look as uniform and I didn't really like it. So that would go something like that. And usually this would be on a bed of parsley, so it would have a bit of support, but we don't have parsley right now. So what I'm going to do is just fan these out a little bit, just so you can see the smoke ring, you can see a little bit of the exposed meat. And I might come back in here and add just a little bit of the hot clarified butter, just so it looks nice and glistening when it gets turned into the judges. And all this would go in a turn-in box, and that is basically how I would turn it into the judges. See how it's nice and glistening? It hasn't oxidized, it doesn't look dry, even though it's probably room temperature now. Okay, let's take a look at this now. I'd probably give it a score of 8 out of 9 for appearance, because the burnt ends are a little bit ununiform. It would look a lot better in a turn-in box on a bed of parsley or some kale, but you know, maybe I'd give it a 9. I'd probably spend some more time on this during the point slicing, and I'd make the burnt ends a little bit more uniform to get me a 9 instead of an 8, but these look pretty good. So I'm gonna try a flat slice first. So this is what a judge would do. They would look at it, they would be looking at it like this from your perspective, and they'd pull it apart, they'd see how tender it is. It had a little bit of pull, maybe I sliced it a little bit too thick, but it's not too bad. It's got good flavor. It tastes really beefy and salty. I think the injection is really shining through. A ton of flavor in this brisket, and there's just a hint of sweet, which I think would really go well with the judges. I think that for taste, a lot of judges might even give this a 9. For tenderness, I could have sliced them a little bit thinner and maybe cooked this a little bit longer. I think it's about an 8 for tenderness. So I'd probably give it an 8 for appearance, an 8 for tenderness, maybe a 9 for taste, maybe an 8 or 9. And maybe a couple judges would give this a 7 if they were feeling mean for tenderness. But it's actually pretty tender. See, if I take this slice, which is a bit thinner, and then I pull it apart, I mean, it pulls apart like nothing. So I think on some of these slices, they're a bit thicker. Maybe a judge would give me a 7 or 8, and some of them would be 9s for tenderness. So now let's take a bite of the burnt end. Those are really good burnt ends, very tender, and because you have to blend the scores of each piece, so you have to blend the tenderness and taste scores of both the point and the flat slices, I think that these burnt ends would boost my tenderness score if a judge was on the edge about whether he wanted to give me a 9, for example, for tenderness on this. So overall, really good. I think it would do quite well in a brisket turn-in box in the KCBS competition. It probably wouldn't get straight 9s. It probably wouldn't win me first place brisket, but pretty good for a very low marbled choice grade brisket, in my opinion. The one thing I would say is that this is probably on par texture-wise and juiciness-wise with competition briskets that I've tasted in my experience, but the briskets that I cook at home, my Texas-style briskets, are much more juicy in the flat area. So I'm really interested to see if the whole brisket that we cooked whole will be any juicier. The individual muscle fibers are just a little bit grainy. They're not pot roasty, but they're just a little bit dry, almost like they've seen a little bit too much salt, a little bit too much heat over time, and they just don't have that super juicy flavor that I usually get when I cook briskets whole. All right guys, here's the whole brisket. That is the point that I sliced off and then put on the smoker. This only went on for about a half an hour because I just don't have time right now to wait for another half an hour to an hour. But it looks like the bark is pretty set in certain areas. It got some smoke, so I'm liking the look of that. I think it's gonna be fine. Now in Myron Mixon's videos where he shows us how he makes his competition briskets, he actually sauces the brisket with probably a little bit thicker sauce than I'm using right now, a lot thicker by the looks of it. Probably a little bit more sweet than this. This is kind of just like an au jus with just a little bit of sauce in it for a little bit of sweetness. And then he puts it back on the smoker to tack up. So I could do that right now, but I'm just gonna go ahead and slice this up and show you guys how I'd turn it in. So that's gonna be the bottom side, and then we're going to get some sauce. Then we're gonna get some au jus on the top here, just to make it glisten a little bit. And now I'm just going to look for an area that is pretty even, and I'll slice it right off. About an inch thick. Get some tallow on the exposed surface. And I would probably spend some more time on this if I was at an actual competition. But just for the purpose of expediency, I'm just gonna use this slice right here, take that edge off. So like I said, I'd probably spend more time, but for now, I'm okay with this. Just put a little bit of au jus on here. And now, same thing with the flat. What Myron Mixon does in his videos is he removes the fat cap. So I'm just gonna slice this right off. Its only purpose was to protect the meat and preserve moisture. Now, if you wanted to follow Myron's method to the T, then you would sauce the exposed surface here and then you tack it up on the smoker for a few minutes. But for the sake of expediency, I'm just going to put some au jus on the back here. I'm gonna flip it over and then I'm gonna look at which way the grains run. They're running towards you right now. So I'm going to look at where my slices are going to come from. And I'll slice this little tip off. And remember, every time we expose a surface, we're covering it in tallow. And then I'd go to right about here, square it off. More tallow. And then over here-ish, square that off. And just make sure that's gonna fit in my turn-in box. So usually your hand is about 6 inches long, so this is just under it. It's probably around 5.5 inches, which is what Myron Mixon recommends in at least one of his videos that I saw. Slice this guy off. Okay, so now we've got something that looks roughly like what we had before with our individually point and flat separated brisket. So now I'm going to just start slicing. So that is roughly how I would turn in some brisket at a KCBS competition. I would take a little bit more time. I would make sure that those burnt ends are squared up and in line with the flat slices behind them. I would probably fan out those slices a little bit more, but nice smoke ring, nice sheen to them. All that fat is creating a nice sheen. It's preventing it from oxidizing. So that's a pretty good looking turn-in box. All right, let's take a look at these. I'd probably give it about a 7 or 8 for appearance, but as I said before, I'd take a little bit more time with it if I was actually turning it in for a competition. So let's take a slice here, and this is how the judge would be looking at it. They would do a pull test. It actually pulls a lot easier than the other brisket. Tenderness is better than the other brisket. It's not a 9 in tenderness, but I think 1 or 2 judges might actually give it a 9. I think most judges would definitely give it an 8. The muscle fibers are just a little bit less dry. They have some texture to them. They're more coated in moisture, and they just taste more beefy. I like this brisket better than the other one. And for taste, I'd probably give this a 9. It has a lot of taste, has a little hint of sweetness, but it's very savory, very beefy. Love the flavors. Okay, I'm gonna taste a burnt end now. Yeah, that's really good. Oh, I think that would bump my score up to a 9 in tenderness actually, so this would probably be a pretty good turn-in box. If I made the appearance a little bit better, I think this would be really good. These burnt ends though, 1,000 times better than the other burnt ends. So what is the best method out of these two? Should you cook your brisket whole or should you separate the point and the flat for competition brisket? Well, it kind of depends. As you can see in this video, we had very, very thin flat slices. And also this was a choice grade brisket, but it didn't have a lot of marbling. So it was probably closer to a select grade brisket, which is something that I typically wouldn't use for a competition. But I would have to say that if you're using a brisket with a thinner flat and or it's a lower grade, maybe it's select or lower grade choice, and it doesn't have a lot of intramuscular marbling, I would definitely cook the brisket whole. The whole brisket that I cooked using the Myron Mixon method was way better than the other brisket with the point and flat separated. And I think that's because with briskets that have thinner flats and they have less marbling, there's just more surface area exposed, more opportunity for them to dry out during the cook. And so separating the point from the flat doesn't retain as much juiciness and doesn't cook the brisket as well as cooking it whole. So if you have a huge Wagyu or prime grade brisket with a enormously thick flat, I think you can get away with separating the point from the flat. But in all other cases, if you have a lower grade brisket or a thinner flat, I would definitely recommend using Myron Mixon's method of cooking the brisket whole. It just turns out way juicier and more tender results. So thanks so much for watching, guys. If you have any other ideas for experiments you want to see on the show, let me know in the comments section below. And until next time, happy smoking.